Buenos días. I want to first really honor the mountain, the river, and the ancestors of this land, this powerful land that really have engaged in the production of a long history and cultural history. I want to also thank the director of the Kunst, Meran, for really opening, and the board of the museum for opening to have this type of programming in this place. And I also want to thank Simone and Lucrecia for creating this type of curatorial project, who is, I could have a long reading of it, but, and also Belinda for the great work that she have done in this space. Okay.
Yeah, no, I want to echo those thank yous in terms of the invitation. It's a real honor to be here and to share ideas that we can discuss, debate, and I hope sort of move around in the space, in dialogue with the exhibition, in dialogue with the space, and in dialogue with each other, so that we could walk away from here with some of these things. We decided, with speaking with Raul yesterday, we decided that we would try to do some short presentations of specific aspects of our practice, and then have an informal conversation between the two of us, because of course it's a rare occasion to be sitting up here together. And then, you know, kind of open up so that there's an opportunity to also attend to some questions of the audience. So this is some of the format that we'll engage with.
Bien. I want to start reframing the idea of restitution or reparation, because museums, in the museum world, there is this stereotype of restitution, of taking back human remains and artifacts. And I just wanted to amplify the notion of restitution as also bringing, restituting knowledge, restituting the body, the landscape, the environment, way of knowing and thinking. And I want to, in that, also amplifying, I should say, I don't want to call it a definition, but an interpretation maybe that I have, that how Belinda, and in her work, she have restituted the cultural memory of this environmental place, bringing the stones from the river, so into her installation. And that's a really physical and real example that restitution is not only about sending back the works that have been stolen by colonial powers from Africa, Latin American. I mean, it's bigger than that. And in that case, my presentation, I do restitution in the foundation of knowledge and decolonial knowledge. And what I'm going to present is not only a process of knowledge and decolonial knowledge that I do through my curatorial practices, but they are also the foundation of my artistic practices. I don't see my work at the museum detached from my work as an artist. And many of those who do exhibition design, if nowhere for my skills as an artist and an installation artist, I will have a lot of problems doing exhibition design and my knowledge of architecture. So I just want to point out that even though I'm going to discuss these issues this is the way in which I organize my curatorial and my artistic practices. Oh, I can't. Okay. Can I go? Thank you. First of all, I want to really give homage and an honor to this Brazilian Italian artist and museum, Lina Bobardi, who is a Brazilian Italian for Brazilians, Latin Americans, Cuban Americans, Latino. She is like the great grandmother of curatorial practices. And let's talk about restitution, because Lina Bobardi was doing restitution in the 40s with her curatorial practices in Sao Paulo, Brazil. So for those who think that this is now a new, buzzword, restitution have been going on for a long time. And I always reinscribe Lina Bobardi in my conversations, because not only her curatorial practices was really founded in the colonial practices also in the 1940s, but recognizing the importance of culture and the landscape and the cultures from that space and that location within her curatorial practices. I study filmmaking at the University of Iowa, and I had the really great privilege of study a whole workshop on Pier Paolo Pasolini by an Italian scholar, Giampiero Brunetta from Bologna. And I had to study Pasolini in Italian, even though there were a lot of films that were not had subtitles. But Pasolini and his fight for his ethnic background was really important for me as a Cuban American and a Latino filmmaker in the United States, trying to be an independent filmmaker and really fight the Hollywood structure. And in many ways, I saw Pasolini since I was a kid, so I have been in love with his film. But I want to bring his memory and his spirit into this conversation. The coloniality, and as we, as a foundation and the way I work, has to do a lot with the body. Modernity is still engaged with visuality and the ideology of the visual, and they, even though we have media today with sound, that takes the touching, the tactile, all the other senses, the smell, have been relegated to very marginal spaces. And so as a result, then culinary arts are not in the museum, in the Western Museum, because it's like, that's not art, when in fact it is. It's only modernity, and especially in the 1700s, they were detached from the idea of cultural practices. And also colonization as being embedded, especially for myself and many people of my community who have understood that coloniality and colonization go deep into our psyches and our bodies. And many of us who have studied in Western institutions, we have studied very well Western European art, but we are not taught. We have to go to the library and do deep research in order to acknowledge and recognize the cultural practices from our territory. And so in a certain way, I want to bring that point, that because museums as bodies needs to also understand how coloniality have been, not only as we were talking about museum visitor, but there is a lot of colonial modern practices, like having the visitor coming in and just moving in a linear way to live. The exhibition, that's part of how coloniality works on the museum, even the way in which the way that the heights that the paintings have to be placed. I had in my own practices and museum constantly because I wanted to bring the painting to a certain level. Oh, that's a child level, and many people do not understand that the cube could be transformed into a multi-geometric space, and that they will have the elements in the museum to change the way in which the exhibition design is being placed, and that is part of reparation and restitution too. Needs to be understood in that way. So I'm going to talk about this element in a very short way, but I think it's really important to know that time, Western modern time, is linear. It's Euclidean time, things beginning, middle, and end. And so, that is a multiplicity of time. That is parallel time. That is cosmic time. That is the past. The indigenous people of the America, the future is in the past, it's not ahead of us. So it is important to reconfigure the idea of time when we are producing curatorial projects and artistic practices. Also the idea of movement. Western thought is based on Euclidean geometry. It's linear, Many of which now it becomes funny to me that when I am in a conversation in the Western museums, they always say, Raul, go to the point. I know what they mean. It's just they get lost. When I'm articulating different points, and trying to weave them in a certain way, multi-geometric way, that they are not being trained to it. And I feel I bring this up because many in the Western museums, people don't know how their own practices have colonized themselves and how limited they are because these have been installed in the 60s and 1500s with modernity. And in the same way, space, the alphabet, I was talking about the senses and the importance to, and really it is very important to think about the senses when the museum visitor come into the space. Because this ideology of the visual also somehow doesn't take into consideration visually impaired people, people with mobility issues. And so when we start thinking about the museum as a multisensorial space, then the way in which exhibitions are being presented bring restitution to a cosmic way in which we, modernity, have detached us since we are not animal and superior, as modernity says. We need to come back to the idea of understanding that we are cosmic subject and understand geometry in a cosmic way. And so with that, I'm going to go to the next one because I'm going to keep explaining. Now, one of, in the 15 and 1600s, because of coloniality and colonization, in the other side of the Atlantic, there is the myth that Columbus discovered America. The fact is, the only thing that he discovered was that he was lost, period, because the continent have been there for many years. The Vikings have been going to North America for a long time. The Polynesians have going to South America for many years. So that, this myth of coloniality, this idea of discovery, needs not only to be deconstructed, but also to be understood at the way in which the space and modern cartography, when we look at modern cartography, Europe looks like so big, and in reality, the relationship in space and the global territory, in the global, and ¿cómo se dice globo terráqueo? Huh? The global terrestre, you know. Really, we see at the physical dimensions, and so we have grown and been educated to an artificial construction of a space, in which that when you work on not only museum and as an artist, you really need to question this idea, but not only that idea of that in during the transatlantic navigation, the idea of the North become the point of orientation. And so we have been colonized to understand orientation, body orientation, space orientation to the North, when in fact, if we look back to before Eurocentrism, and going back as Enrique Dusso asked us to go and to be transmodern during the 7th century, all the cultures in the world, I mean Greek, Hindus, Persian, Chinese, Incas, Bantu, the East, because of the sun, was the space of orientation. And this is really critical because many of the environmental problems that we have in today has to do with this artificial construction of a space that modernity brought as an idea of progress, But the progress, colonial progress, only have brought destruction of the planet. And so when we are doing exhibition design, when we're thinking at the museum, because we cannot destroy the cube and the museum. I think I'm not into binary opposition. I don't think that the cube need to be destroyed because the cube is another geometric form that could be transformed through a creative process. So, I just want to bring into example, because Anna, 1/3 indigenous Cuban, the way in which my ancestral and still today space is being understood for indigenous Caribbean, in which the east is the point, and even in the Caribbean, the hurricanes come from the east. So it's really important. I have grew up with this sense of the orientation, and many times I have to confront my art teachers because they tell me that I don't know how to create a space, and I was like, But I went and studied in Western institutions, so that could have been expected. The Bantu also. You want to take a photograph of this? Yes, because this is important. This is really important. When we think about restituting on reparation, we need to start first from ourselves, from our body. It's really, sending the artifact back to Africa is really important. But if we don't restitute and repair ourselves, the restitution become another colonial movement, another colonial gesture. It doesn't really work. So the idea also, modernity imposed Latin alphabetic writing as the only writing, But this was a mechanism invented by Eurocentrism in order to really fictionalize history and place themselves ahead of the rest of the people. And so when this happened, many of the even European indigenous cultures and languages were displaced. The Vikings were barbaric, so were the Germans too, And so this needs to be really understood and really go deep into it, especially in spaces when we are pluricultural, when we have diverse languages going on in the same space. And that's something that in my museum I have to deal with it, because even though it is understood as being an African-American museums, there are Afro-Caribbeans, there are Haitians, there are Latinos who speak Spanish. So I have to confront this idea of, colonial language and how I can transform my levels and access my community in languages that are not really, I should say, only monolingual situation. And so after I understood this, it was how, even though I'm a bilingual, but it wasn't until this became clear that I understood the importance of having multilingual levels when you do museum exhibition. And that's another way of doing reparation and bringing communities into a space. Because otherwise, this one will be like, it is called calligraphy, which is not, it's a language, and it's a written language, And so Chinese also is called calligraphy. And I think many of us by now know that this is, another type of alphabet. It's not Latin, but it's an alphabet, and it's a language. It's not a dialect, which is the same thing happens with people who like mix. Sometimes, I have to confront many people who say, oh, you speak Spanglish, that's a dialect. No, that's a language. The Latinos who speak Spanish and English have figured out as a cultural formation to create language. That's how language is being formed, by people, not by books. Okay? So this is Afro-Caribbean writing, although it is related to witchcraft. That's what I thought until I went to school and studied West African art. And I realized that I come from a very old tradition of writing. And I can tell you by now, but I'm not going because I don't have time, where the alphabet is there. Because I had the chance to study and to talk to people who didn't go to college, and they know how to write it. And they speak it. And so I'm going beyond my time. Okay. Because this is important too, okay? Especially, in the place that we are, and how Kant, Kant's aesthetics have dominated the museum in ways that is still today, and it was Kant who, the foundation of racism and colorizing people, sexism, is in the observation of the feeling of the beautiful and the sublime, 1764. And still today, when you go to study art history, who is the Kant, who was very racist in many ways and sexist, and says that African people didn't have nothing to offer to culture and to Europeans' culture. And it's written in his book, page 26, according to the book that I have read, but it's there, And with this happening, to many of us, now my restitution, my work, have developed a series of 3 exhibitions dealing with the idea of how, still today, African descendants and indigenous people are and look at primitive and savage. And still in the last presidential election, Trump and Vance went out saying that Haitian people were eating cats from the street. And so where the indigenous people in the 1500s, Bray and his prince was replicating the idea of the savage. And with that, this is going to finish because this is another Italian scholar, very important for us in the other side of Atlantic, Antonello Gerbi, who have he went to the Americas and recognized that it's a whole train in Western philosophy of constructing the savage. So his book, I just want to finish my intervention with bringing back his book because it's in Italian, in Spanish, English, in many, and he can also, in the way in which that we decolonize our bodies, you know, we have to decolonize Western philosophy in many, many ways, because a lot of Western philosophy has been constructed on fiction. So with that,
Okay. Well, yeah, thank you, Raul, for that. And I know that yesterday he warned me. He said, "You're gonna try to follow my presentation." I said, "I'll do my best." But I think it's really important because I know that the work that Raul is doing is also really about reorienting ourselves, repositioning, and really reflecting on how much of our perspectives are constructed for us. And what I wanted to talk about was that, the idea of perspective, and also just sort of what alternatives there might be as we address the idea of museum structures and what to do, right? Or how to do it. I like to talk a lot about practice, about methodology, about processes, and as the director of a space called the Recovery Plan, a research center, the Recovery Plan is born in part from a really big lack of satisfaction with institutional structures. As a professor, as an artist, on so many different levels. And so an awareness that so many of us as artists, as cultural practitioners, we know that a lot of the institutional structures take their lead from people, from organizations, from grassroots movements, right? And the ideas that emerge in those spaces beyond the institutional structure. And because they're taking the lead from that, there's a lot of space and possibility outside of those structures to also engage in a form of construction that helps to sort of undo some of the perspective that is so well formed. I put this quote up here this morning. And so sorry for the space between ensembles and of. I think you could still read it, right? But I think that, you know, the real chance for the philosophy of the human being is about that reorienting, that repositioning, right? The possibility that is offered through this sort of critical engagement. And so I'm gonna walk you through some aspects of the work that has gone into constructing something like the Recovery Plan, and mainly the processes and methodologies in terms of just a vision for some approaches to working. This chart is something that we've been using for many years, but I think it's helpful. You mentioned, Raul mentioned hurricanes coming from the east, and in the moment of 2017, 2018, we were doing a lot of work in the context of Italy, looking at and thinking about archives and archival traces and how to deal with all of those absences of the archive, how to deal with the necessity to reconstruct. Also, what gets recognized as an archive, what values we give to the conversations and perspectives that people lend to these histories. And what to do when there isn't that archival trace that we might be looking for. What are the alternatives? And in thinking that through, one of the technical aspects was that we were encouraged very often to think about recovery plans. So in relation to safeguarding archival traces, research, findings from unforeseeable disasters or foreseeable disasters, right? So theft, hurricanes, all of these things that put your archive at risk. But because we were working really looking at a Black archive in the context of Italy, and because we have this understanding of history that is aware of the influence of the past on giving us a path to understand our futures. Unfortunately, Black archives in the space of Italy are kind of constantly in a state of disaster, right? There's a disastrous lack of care. There's a disastrous lack of recognition. There's a disastrous lack of collection of material. And I could go on in terms of the valuing, right? And so we actually decided to use a chart that comes from disaster recovery. So this is not a plan that is anchored in anything other than recovering from the disaster. And that recovery is simultaneously tied to recovering fragments of history. So all of these aspects that have not been collected or have been narrated through a perspective that is designed to kill their power. But also recovery as a society, because I think that unfortunately this orientation has also made it so that a lot of people feel that these are things that concern only people of African descent. And so they feel that this lack of appreciation for history in its more complete narration, a reorientation, has only to do with people of African descent. And this is very misguided, right? So the recovery is recovery also as a society. When we encounter histories, when we encounter stories, there's a form of recovery for all of us that's involved in that. And it's actually easier to dismantle it when we see it as only valid within one space or to one group of people. And so I wanted to walk you through just some of these methodologies, some of the practices, some of the language around them. And so in this idea of disaster recovery, the first thing that is done is recovering data, just really thinking about what information is out there. And we wanted to think about what the collection of data means for us in our work, and it's really about a certain form of recognition. I mean, what Raul is talking about is also recognizing things that are actually all around us, but that have not been recognized, right? And so the recognition of fragments of history, narratives, modes of knowledge production, and I'll let you read the rest. But I think that, you know, it's also really, really about who do we look to for this knowledge, for this reorientation. Because if we look exclusively to institutional structures for this, I think it's misguided in terms of what the output will be. Raul was talking about sort of the alphabets and the writing, you know, that he was familiar with as a child, that later recognized in terms of their importance, right? So who do we look to in order to reorient it ourselves, in order to really base our work on what's around us? I think I did that right. Yeah. Okay. And so just like I'm going to walk you through just one example of a couple things, because I think it's helpful to kind of give some concrete examples also. So gathering data, I spent the first 20 years of living in Italy, essentially encountering Black figures in museums, mapping them, drawing them, writing about them, without having encountered very many books, without ever encountering historical narration. And I mean, you know, I'm going to give that the importance that it needs, but without reading an art historian writing about it. And so really formulating my own ideas through comparison. And in 2019, I had the opportunity to have this kind of conversation with the Uffizi galleries, because unfortunately, when we are thinking about institutional structures, it's important to think about who we're looking to, but it's also important to think about who we're reaching. And institutions have the power to reach a broader demographic in a way that is undeniable. And the Uffizi galleries, in the context of Florence, doing research around Black history in the context of Florence, Florence is sort of the ultimate gatekeeper of the Renaissance in Europe, right? And if Florence is that gatekeeper, then the Uffizi galleries is the ultimate gatekeeper of that art history, right? And living in Florence for so long, I was aware that I could name 50 paintings without even going into the archives, and that I had encountered very little information about them. And so this process of inviting scholars of art history, music, to discuss these paintings was really about also forms of self-narration from within the institution. So even a very simple thing like stating where people came from, different aspects of their condition in regards to society, nothing revolutionary. But somehow that providing that through a language that is not strictly academic, In short form, 250 words was the maximum that I allowed for these scholars. And the fact that it was also really encouraging a number of scholars who had never worked on the Black figures in paintings. And for anyone that knows art history, scholars study random shit in paintings all the time, right? And somehow they had overlooked people, right? Of the 10 people in a painting, right? So I think this is telling to us in terms of just the framing of things. And just like, also, this wasn't an invitation from the Uffizi. This is me going to the Uffizi and saying, I think we should do this thing, right? And the online platform means that it has more circulation. So the gathering of data is simultaneously about the 20 years prior, right? And then about encountering people that I knew would be important to have involved in this process of narration, right? And then the platform that would allow the biggest range of people to actually encounter the material itself so that they wouldn't find themselves like me looking at stuff and hearing invented stories from tour guides. So in terms of analysis, I like to think about impact through two different lenses. One is the impact of the work that is done. So if we were to analyze the impact of the work on being present as a project within the Uffizi, we could analyze that through the capacity of art history classes teaching the Renaissance to have easy access to material that they didn't have access to before. But I think also really the impact of society, because the canons of art themselves is destructive, right, to so much knowledge production. It produces a certain value. Honestly, my studies in art history as an artist told me that I shouldn't be interested in art history because they were so placed in the positions of power that were commissioning the work as the only thing I was supposed to know that I couldn't. We talk about museums, we talk about art history and the struggle with relevance. As an artist working today, I struggle with relevance, looking at art history where I'm learning about the Medicis rather than learning anything about artistic production, right? And what it actually means outside of the forces that are producing economically these systems. I struggled for relevance. And so in this context, it's also lacking consideration for all of the things that, when I would walk around Rome and they would give me the art historical lecture on the monuments without talking about genocide, without talking about extraction of the earth, without talking about the very marble that was sitting in front of us that took millions of years to be formed. It seemed really misguided in terms of the framing, right? And they continue. And so like this is one dynamic, and we presented this recently also in Rome. So on being present in the conversations there mean that then I can have a conversation with someone who's writing a documentary like Francesca Priori, and that leads to yet another orientation around a conversation that gets wider spread, right? There's some limitations, of course, to like who's producing these things and narration, but I think in terms of tools that move, right, the impact of this work means that we can do this other work a lot of times. And, in terms of methodologies, I think it's really important to think about the disciplinary divisions, and this within university structures are vicious. But I think, of course, they're very true also in art museums. So what Raul was talking about in terms of culinary arts, in terms of all of these other things that involve the body, they're clearly segregated from everything else. A lot of times given lesser importance, right? And so, really thinking about how we can learn from these things. One of the heartbeats or pulses of the recovery plan is a library. And that library is a simple gesture of collective activity. So I went to, essentially, I went to public school in the United States. Growing up, I did not read any Black books until I was a teenager because they were never assigned to me. I thought I didn't like reading in the same way I thought I didn't like art history. Right? And so these are these structures that actually keep us from understanding also what our interests are, right? It was my brother, it was my grandfather that started buying books for me. When they saw that I was interested in art, they bought books that talked about Black artists. And I understood through reading, first, why I was so angry as a child, because I was very angry. And then second, all of the different ways that I could actually be really excited about learning, about engagement, about all these fragments of history that weren't being taught to me. And so Library on Loan is essentially just borrowing books from scholars, artists, activists, and sharing those. So essentially the books that I had to buy in order to learn something, keeping them together, and this collective sharing is something that also allows us to talk about our specific interest through the collection of books, right? But I think it's that gesture of sharing, of placing these things together, that is particularly important, because it's something that can be, and you'll see this later, it can be set up anywhere, right? Like I like to think about like bringing us into cause and say that like if tomorrow all of us were show up here with the museum with some books, there would be a library immediately, right? And so the capacity that we have to construct these things is really, really important. And then another thing is just, again, I told you before I was dissatisfied with so many of the structures around me. One of the things I was dissatisfied with is that I started at a younger age to try to go to academic conferences because I started to realize that there was a lot of research that I was interested in that was only happening there. And every time I would apply for a call for papers, they would say, we want you to come, but we don't want you to talk about your research. We want you to talk about your art, right? And that's like, you know, that's an interesting invitation. I said yes, because we bend. But I think it's important to think about what's being recognized. So when artists are being recognized as the carriers of expression alone, right, then you're not recognizing all the specificities of artistic research, all of the insights that can be produced through the kinds of research that we engage in, the ways in which they can unpack some of the academic disciplines in different ways. They can challenge the reliance upon certain conditions. And so this is just a series of exhibitions that are dedicated to artist research, where artists are invited to share whatever aspect they're reading or thinking about or studying, and what study looks like to them, so that then as an institution, as a space, we can learn, we can apply those same practices. And Semi Balogi's work down here, this is an outgrowth of work that was coming directly through the Uffizi galleries, and I'll see that later. And you know, the templates, I think it's really important to kind of move beyond the idea of, I grew up with a sort of a certain fear of people saying to me, that an audience was not ready for a certain thing, or that I wasn't ready for a certain thing. And because of that, I spent a lot of time focused on preparation and what preparation actually means, right? And ultimately, I think one of the things that happens is that this becomes yet another self-censoring, right? Where we feel not prepared to engage in certain activities, conversations, whether for lack of funding, lack of space, whatever it is. And again, not recognizing that actually collectively we have all of these things, right? And so the idea of developing templates were about really coming up with strategies, right, for this kind of recovery in relation to the disaster that was around us, but then not creating them for ourselves and not branding them as ours, but making sure that they're open in their form, that they're shareable, and you know, that in that collectivity, like all of those things are just there for anybody to pick up on, and that we don't necessarily always need to be inventing much of anything. Because what Raul was attending to also is the fact that all of these things, these are practices that are ancient, right? And a lot of times it's just about reorienting the way that we're looking at them and giving value, right? So examples of that, in 2016, I co-founded Black History Month in Florence. And through the process, these numbers are not correct because I'm not good at updating slides, but call it 500, call it 200, I don't know. It's numbers. But in the context of Black History Month, it was simply a way of organizing institutions together in a singular program. It was nothing more than that. It's February, what are you doing, right? And it's actually really, it can be very easy because everybody's doing programming. And so it's actually getting people to be a part of the same program that's the difficulty, right? And so getting people to direct the resources they're already directing towards their programming, but actually just thinking about what the content is, right? And then mainly working on a desire to actually share space, right? The dismantling of the fact that the logo for the Uffizi Gallery needs to be bigger than the logo of a local association, right? We have to dismantle this stuff, that there's an order to that this one needs to be here and this one needs to be there. These are the arguments I have daily, right? But I think it's really just a really important dimension to think about, so that then this is something that gets picked up in other cities. And these are all autonomous, right? They're not directed in any way by us, right? They're all autonomous. They all have completely different visions of what this work is. And in that process, the magic is that then we learn from what they're doing, right? Because I think that's when we're sort of sharing more collectively, that's the magic of that, right? Templates like Black Archive Alliance, which is simply about rethinking archives, rethinking what that research looks like and who's involved in it, recognizing a boxer like Leonard Bundu, who's a Florence-based boxer, as important as the collection of the Uffizi Gallery, right, for us. Recognizing Andy Ndakuba, an architect who had a Black-run space in Florence for about 10 years, as important of an archive as the Uffizi Galleries. It's really, and this is not to harp upon the Uffizi Galleries, it's not so relevant, but it's just a simple example, right? And so Black Archive Alliance really thinking about who's involved, student-led conferences, the development of tours, guides, and mainly developing a print-based process that allows also the material itself to not need an institutional structure to be housed. So these are not the documents which need to be preserved inside display cases and frames in glass, but they can show up inside centri sociali, they can show up inside of elementary schools directly, right? And I think that these are really important steps. And I wanted to bring this work up as well, because in terms of templates for us, working with Sami Baloggi and with Lucrezia on a process of really rethinking the collection of Cosimo de' Medici in the mid-1500s in relation to the Kingdom of Congo led to many conversations about Congolese objects and they're being classified as ethnography, they're being classified as art, and the slippages of this classification. And so we returned to a catalog that was published in 1920, celebrating what was to be the first exhibition of African sculpture in the Venice Biennial. Of course, the entire collection of work was taken from ethnographic museums, Pigurini and then the Ethnographic Museum in Florence. And to really think about what that framing was doing, the racism and colonialism of the language that was celebrating it, and then inviting Afro-Brazilian cultural anthropologists to comment through note-taking on this catalog. Not erasing the words that are there, but highlighting what it's actually talking about and highlighting the impulses that are simply being reinscribed and helping us to understand that this isn't simply a thing of the 1920s, but this is the framework that's developed in relation to artists of African descent to this day, right? And then, the trial implementation, I've already kind of showed you all of this, but people that are involved, including children, including academics, and then really thinking about what's scalable and continuity. So working beyond the idea of the project. And this is just a simple example of these sort of timelines overlapping. So 2018 through Black Archive Alliance, working with Ingrid Greenfield on some portraits in the Uffizi galleries, and then that leading to conversations directly with the Uffizi Gallery that we have enough of a relationship to be able to develop on being present, and then on being present leading to the exhibition, because then I could talk to the director of the Uffizi and convince him how important it was to think not just about the portraits representing people of African descent, but the objects that talked about a different level of exchange that was happening in the Renaissance period between the Kingdom of Congo and Italy, and Portugal, and to really think about how an exhibition dedicated to the collecting practices of the Uffizi was as important of a narration, right? And then going from there, whenever we do these kinds of projects in the context of Florence, we're always thinking about, okay, but our space, what is possible in our space that's not possible there? So Lucrezia knows, I think we had 1,200 characters of text in that exhibition. That was difficult to say the least, right, when these kinds of limitations are there. But what I told Semi is we have no limitation. We have no word limits. We have no limitations on what we can do when you move into the research realm of the recovery plan. And so all of these other things and celebrations of the people that were involved in the process were possible, right? And I think just sort of, to close, I think you know, the idea of care, right? So once you're doing all of this work, what does care actually look like? And, you know, for me, a lot of it is collective care. There's so many people that are involved in this process. And, you know, it's about sort of making sure that things are not, this isn't a project within the institution, but the institution understands it as part of their own development within. And so that there's longevity, and sometimes that takes really being a bit of a jerk and insistent in all of this, right? But sometimes it takes just sort of making sure that those terms are inscribed in the very beginning, but then more than anything, caring for the kind of communities that we have around us, right? So my team, we meet regularly just to spend time. We do around half of our programming is internal programming just for the team to spend time learning and engaging in things without necessarily needing a public. And you know, the idea is that all this stuff gets updated every single time so that the cycle is able to continue. So once we've gotten around this cycle, where are we with this thing, right? Because typically we're not very far from where we started, but we need to completely reorient ourselves in relation to those starting points as well. And so this is just a quick timeline of the recovery plan itself, and you know, starting as a pop-up in a gallery space, moving into a museum, and then continuing this cycle of pop-ups. We just closed one at the Italian Culture Institute in Toronto. And so thinking about how the constant reevaluation of what the recovery plan is and can be, even outside of our physical space, is extremely important. And so, yeah, I think that's it, yeah.